Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And welcome to this session of the virtual reading group. We are continuing to read Hannah Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, A Report on the Banality of Evil. Today we're talking about the chapters 7 and 8. Chapter 7 on the Wannsee Conference, or Pontius Pilate, and then chapter 8 on the duties of the obedient or the law-abiding citizen. I would say that in many ways these are the chapters that are the moral center of the book. They are also probably the two most controversial chapters of the book. And they're the chapters in which Arendt says many things that have probably more than anything else she's written gotten her into an enormous amount of controversy, brought her criticism, and brought her trouble. So this should be an exciting and engaging hour and a half. I imagine there's going to be some pretty good disagreements today. And so I'm just going to ask that as we do this, people engage in that spirit of respectful disagreement. And continue, please, to turn off your mics if you're not speaking, so we don't get feedback. I'm hearing someone's mic. If the mic is on, please do turn it off. With that introduction, let me say that there's a number of themes in these two chapters. The first one, comes from the Wannsee Conference, which is simply a historical theme on one level, and yet obviously it's more than that. This is the conference in which the final solution was agreed upon and imposed on the German and Nazi bureaucracy. Eichmann was, as Arendt describes it, in a sense, the secretary who helped Heydrich convene it and run it. And it was a huge moment for Eichmann. And it was simply, as a historical moment, it was the turn at which Eichmann ceased to become the person in charge of forced emigration and forced expulsion to now being in charge of forced deportation to extermination camps. And so from a historical point of view of when Eichmann became complicit, not just in racism, anti-Semitism, and crimes against humanity of expulsion, but to mass murder. The Wannsee Conference is that moment. The other two main themes, or the real main theme that then connects both this chapter on Pontius Pilate and the next chapter on the duties of the law-abiding citizen, revolve around the question of conscience. And this is really what most of this chapter is about conscience. And there's a whole slew of perspectives and different viewpoints from which Arendt now begins to raise this question of conscience. So even in the earlier chapter that we had discussed last week on the final solution, on page 91 of the book, Arendt says that the question of the book and the question that is now raised is the question of Eichmann's conscience. And this question of Eichmann's conscience, in that chapter on 93, she says the question as she frames it is, it was of great political interest to know how long it takes an average person to overcome his innate repugnance toward crime. How long it takes, as she'll later put it, for the conscience to turn around and no longer prevent you from doing something wrong, but actually encourage you or require you to do something morally wrong. And this ties into the chapter on the duties of a law-abiding citizen, because what Arendt is going to argue is that in a way that had never really been actualized so fully, what we see during the Holocaust and during the Nazi regime is someone like Eichmann feeling a conscientious duty to mass murder. And what happens is that the normal way that conscience works is that conscience is supposed to resist your inclinations to disobey the law and to do bad things and follow the law. Now, following the law was what would lead to bad things, and you had to resist your inclination to break the law. And so for her, this gets turned around, so that conscience loses the quality of temptation, or evil, she says, loses the quality of temptation. Evil no longer is a temptation to break the law. Evil is actually obedience to the law. And what she says is that Eichmann learned too well the ability to resist the temptation to be good. Now, we can have an argument about whether we believe he had that temptation, but she thinks he did at times, and she thinks he learned to resist it. That's one way that conscience will come in. Another way that conscience will come in is with the claim that she makes of Eichmann feeling like Pontius Pilate in the chapter on Wannsee, chapter 7. She says on page 114, in the middle of the page, that at that moment, namely the moment of the Wannsee Conference, he says, I sensed a kind of Pontius Pilate feeling, for I felt free of all guilt. He no longer had to have his own thoughts in the matter. Who was he to judge? Right? So this, of course, recalls Pontius Pilate, who presides over the execution of Jesus Christ, and washes his hands of the matter and say, look, the Jews wanted this. Who am I to judge? For Arendt, the reason that Eichmann could feel that way is that he never actually was challenged on it. He saw no one who was against the final solution, with one exception. In the entire trial, the only person that was ever brought up as someone he encountered who raised a question about it was a man named Kastner, Dr. Kastner, who will play a bigger role throughout this book and is an important figure in the history of Israel. But Kastner was negotiating with Eichmann over Himmler over a desire to release 1 million Jews in exchange for 10,000 trucks. And at one point, while Eichmann was helping him do that, he asked Eichmann, could he stop the death mills at Auschwitz? And Eichmann answered, with greatest pleasure, hässlich gern, but that he could not do it. He says that's the only time anyone ever asked him not to do what he was doing or asked him to stop it. And I mean, we've talked about this before, but this question of the lack of anyone who acted or pushed him or suggested to him or in any way gave him uh, an inkling that what he was doing was wrong, um, allowed Eichmann to feel that his conscience required him to, in Arendt's words, um, comply and obey the law. She also talks about those who went into inner immigration. And she distinguishes two different kinds of inner immigration. The very few people who went into inner immigration, like Karl Jaspers, her friend, and who truly suffered for it and refused to comply, didn't oppose the Nazis because there was no real opportunity to oppose them, but clearly exited the system and suffered for it. And those who complied with the system and then later, after, as the Nazis were losing, decided that they were really just an inner immigration and said that they had opposed it all along. And she has utter contempt for those people and their ideas of conscience. She talks about the Jewish resistance fighters and the different levels of Jewish resistance fighters who exercised their conscience in different ways. She talks about Germans like Probst, the man named Probst, who in her mind, while they did have a conscience and did act differently, did not do enough and did not serve as examples. And even when that man Probst met Eichmann, he never actually challenged Eichmann. And Eichmann took from that he was okay in doing what he did. Then, of course, there's the most controversial parts of the book that begins on page 116 and goes through the end of this chapter, where she begins to talk about the Jews who coordinated or in some sense complied, and in other senses even cooperated with the Nazis. And this is the case that gets her into all sorts of hot water. She's talking about the fact that Eichmann came to see the main way he did his job, and remember his job was to deport Jews for extermination, was to organize the Jews and the Jewish community themselves to help him do so. The first thing he did, he says, whenever he goes into a new area to deport Jews, is to organize the Jewish community, appoint Jewish leaders, and appoint a Judenrat, a committee of Jewish leaders, who would then select Jews for deportation and help organize and run that process. At the same time, in the camps, there were kapos, those who did the work of the camps, pulling out gold teeth, exterminating the bodies, burying the bodies, digging up the bodies, whatever was necessary. She describes that actual work of killing that Jews did in the camps as horrible but not yet a moral problem. This is on page 123. But she then goes to say that the moral problem was actually in the description of Jewish cooperation. The fact that there were Jews who actually fully cooperated with the Nazis, often in order to save themselves and their family. She talks about Pinchas Freudiger on page 124. Who was a Judenrat, and he was asked on the stand, why did he cooperate in the destruction of his own people and eventually in your own ruin? And Freudiger, who she describes as an Orthodox Jew of considerable dignity, was shaken, and he writes, this is on 124, there are people here who say they were not told to escape. but 50% of the people who escaped were captured and killed. And Arendt then adds in a kind of opposition, as compared with the 99% for those who did not escape. And this is a point she makes repeatedly, that the Jewish leaders often said, what could we have done? We had to cooperate, or there would have been chaos. And she then cites another study, another claim by the Dutch journalist. This is on page 125, Dr. L. de Jong, who looks at two different situations. One where 103,000 Jews were deported, sent by the Judenräte in Holland, and of them, only 500 survived. So we're talking about, I think, 1% or less. Compare that to the 10,000 of those, in contrast to the 10,000 of those 20 to 25,000 Jews who escaped the Nazis. So 25,000 Jews who escaped, went into hiding, fled, lived in what Freudiger called chaos, survived, which is 40 to 50%. She says a number that fits with what Freudiger had suggested. So what she's saying is, on the one hand, simply pragmatically, if the Jews had simply not cooperated and sowed chaos, it's quite likely that 40 or 50% of them might have survived instead of 1%. Obviously, that's a claim that can't be fully supported, and I don't think she's claiming that it would be. She's simply saying, how could it have been worse than what they did? And then the moral argument, not just the pragmatic argument, she makes on page 118 to 119, where she's talking about Leo Beck, the chief rabbi of Berlin, and Chaim Rukowski, the eldest of the Jews in Lodz, called Chaim the First, who issued currency notes bearing his signature and postage stamps engraved with his portrait, and rode around in a broken-down, horse-drawn carriage. She's obviously contemptuous of Beck and Rumkowski, and she contrasts them with Adam Chesniakow, chairman of the Warsaw Jewish Council, who was not a rabbi but an unbeliever, a Polish-speaking Jewish engineer, but who must have still remembered the rabbinical saying, "Let them kill you, but don't cross the line." Chesniakow committed suicide rather than participate and collaborate with the Nazis. So I'm going to stop there and simply say, look, these are all different ways in which Arendt is addressing what she considers to be the real question of the book in many ways, a question that she frames as the question of, as she says on page 125 to 126, I have dwelt on this chapter of the story, which the Jerusalem trial failed to put before the eyes of the world in its true dimensions, because it offers the most striking insight into the totality of the moral collapse the Nazis caused in respectable European society, not only in Germany, but in almost all countries, not only among the persecutors, but also among the victims. She's going to say that as a Jew, right, this was the darkest chapter of the whole story. This line has, of course, been pointed to as something she should be upset about. And I'm going to stop there and I think I've presented some of the ways in which she's raising this question of conscience, I hope. And I'm assuming there'll be differences of opinion on this. So let's see what you guys have to say about it.
I'll start. It's a very complicated issue. I think as a Jew, I'm deeply saddened at the notion that Jews in any way were complicit or supportive within the constraints of what they knew at the time to help the Nazis do what they did, but they certainly never did that with that intention. I think comparing Chernyakov and Kautsky, let's say, yes, Chernyakov doesn't comply. He commits suicide and everything goes as planned. So I'm not sure how, in a state of affairs where it was hard for Jews to live and eat and survive, let alone organize, this wasn't like the civil rights movement in this country. This is a totalitarian state where everybody lives in fear, where there's so few resistance movements. There's the T4, let's say, and there's Rosenstrasse, and even if you want to say the White Rose, most of these are self-interested by groups who have certain amounts of power within a white Christian society, a Nazi society, an Aryan society. They can lay out their cards that say, look, I'm one of the people that you think matters, and so you have to listen to me. And the wives get their husbands out temporarily from the jails, and the T4 is shut down only to go into hiding. Almost none of these things, even the Browning story of the police battalions, with the one where they say, no, we won't do it. The Jews were killed as much with them as without them. The consequences were never known to be different, and it's inspiring, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but again, they all died. They left us a great story. This was a time of, she's right, moral collapse. Once the Holocaust begins, everybody dies, whether they live or die, because there are no good guys in this thing. The rescuers, again, are almost unbelievable in understanding them and a better understanding of human beings. Human beings did what human beings do, and I get that people are objecting to the ways in which, how dare you indict Jews who are doing everything they could to survive in an impossible condition. And I think there's a wish that they could have done differently, but I'm not sure that wish would have made a difference other than in the storytelling afterward. And I don't know that I would have done differently. It's hard to hear it, I guess. I can understand the pain, but at the same time, I understand the claim.
I think another way of looking at it too is, under those circumstances, is the best thing to resist, or is the best thing to ameliorate? I mean, if you come to the decision that death is the outcome regardless, what is your best action for those who are going to be facing it inevitably? It's obviously a brutally hard question.
Yes, I'm just a couple of points, because I think these are helpful beginnings. One is that it's we can ask whether she indicted the Jewish leaders. She says they had an impossible situation, and there was no real good solution. And she also says it's hard to judge them from afterwards, post facto. But she does. I think she does make some judgments, right? Which is that those who coordinated and complied and cooperated, in her minds, made bad judgments. This is a claim of judgment. On the, what she also wants to say is, if they had made other judgments, yes. I mean, I think what Peter is saying is right. It's a lot of people are going to die in any case, but more people survived when they told people to run. And not only that, the Judenräte, the leaders, at some point, especially in Hungary, had knowledge of what they were sending people to do, right? They knew by that time about the concentration camps, and they didn't tell people about it. And, they said, well, it would have caused chaos. It would have made it worse. But they kept their families and their friends and got them out, many of them.
So I have a question. In that situation, it's easy, like we said, it's easy to know in hindsight. And during the time, they didn't have the actual data to say if you resisted, maybe more people would live. And so if you think every single person's going to die and you have an opportunity to maybe save a few people, is that really worse than just allowing everyone to die. I mean, again, in hindsight, we have complete data knowing, yes, the people who did A turned out better than B. But nobody actually knew 100%. Even if they knew where they were going, they didn't necessarily know what actions would result in what responses.
That's right. And I just want to say, over again, she says very clearly, this is not to blame the Jews for the Holocaust, right? This is not what she's saying. The Jews were these Jewish leaders and Jewish people were in an untenable situation. But of course, in hindsight, things are different. What she is suggesting, though, that she thinks they made an immoral decision. They made a decision with bad judgment, which maybe sometimes is needed. I mean, I think that's what you said, Julia. Sometimes you have to make those tough decisions.
Oh God, Roger.
Who said, "Oh
Roger.
God"? Who said, "Oh God, Roger"?
It sounded like Jerry on the phone, possibly.
Oh, Jerry. Jerry, tell me what you think.
Hi, Jerry.
Hello. No, this is really the central part of this book, and so I'm not quite sure what I was referring to, Roger. If I said that, what have you said?
Well, I mean, I think I tried to say that, I said this was the central part. This is the central question of the book, and I'm not sure it has an answer.
What is the central question of the book?
Well, I think the central question of the book is the different questions of conscience, of Eichmann's conscience, of the resistance conscience.
It's interesting. How did Eichmann's conscience work? You mentioned that earlier, that for a couple of weeks it worked one way and then it changed completely. You didn't explicate that as far as I heard.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, we talked a little bit about that last week, but in the chapter on the final solution or killing, which is on pages, I guess, 93 to 96 or so, she asks the question, for obviously things were not so simple as the framers of the laws had imagined them to be, and if it was of small legal relevance, it was of great political interest to know how long it takes an average person to overcome his innate repugnance toward crime. And then on the next page, she says that Eichmann was, when he went to Lodz and had to watch Jews being killed, he cried, he wet himself, he went back to Heydrich and complained, and then 3 weeks later, he had changed his mind. And she says, thus we are perhaps in a position to answer Judge Landau's question, the question uppermost in the minds of nearly everyone who followed the trial, of whether the accused had a conscience. Yes, he had a conscience, and his conscience functioned in the expected way for about 4 weeks, whereupon it began to function the other way around.
And why was that?
What?
Why was that?
Well, what she says in the next chapter on the duties of the law-abiding citizen, she says that Eichmann never actually encountered anyone who questioned the final solution, and he came to see that it was his conscience to follow the law, even when it went against his inclinations.
Which voices did he hear? The conscience is generally taken as a voice. So if he had a conscience, what voice was he listening to?
That's right.
Before and after.
Right. So what she wants to argue is that in the Nazi period, the conscience gets turned around. So she says that in a criminal regime, when you there's a black flag, the black flag with its warning sign. When you're normally in an army and you're told to do something that is against natural law or against the laws of war, they call it a black flag event. And the black flag stands there, and you're supposed to say, no, I won't do this. Because even though your orders are to do it,
it has nothing to do with conscience. This is a military code you're talking about. I think Arendt, at this point, is not talking about that at all. I think she's talking about what Eichmann's conscience vocally said to him, and what it did not say to him. And if you're arguing, as you've said, the conscience is really, and I couldn't agree more, the central part of these chapters, the very center, as far as human capabilities are concerned. I don't think it should be confused with military orders and black flags and such things as that.
right? Well, let me just
Yeah,
make the case.
I'm sorry to take so much time.
No, Jerry, this is great. So on page 146, I'm just going to make the case, and then we can talk about it.
Yeah.
On page 146, she writes that Eichmann had at all times done his best to make the final solution final, was therefore not in dispute, right? She's not disputing, or no one disputes, that he saw it as his duty to carry out the final solution. The question was only whether this was indeed proof of his fanaticism, his boundless hatred of Jews, and whether he had lied to the police and committed perjury in court when he claimed he had always obeyed orders. And then she writes a little further down near the bottom of that page, for the sad and very uncomfortable truth of the matter, probably was, so it's a probably, was that it was not his fanaticism, but his very conscience that prompted Eichmann to adopt his uncompromising attitude during the last year of the war, as it had prompted him to move in the opposite direction for a short time 3 years before. Eichmann knew that Himmler's orders ran directly counter to the Führer's orders. For this, he needed no factual details. Then she discusses this black flag problem, and she says that it only begs the question of the central moral and legal phenomena of our century, which is the fallback on an unequivocal voice of conscience. And she writes, this is on 149, the case of the conscience of Adolf Eichmann, which is admittedly complicated but is by no means unique, is scarcely comparable to the case of German generals, one of whom, when asked at Nuremberg, how was it possible that all you honorable generals could continue to serve a murderer with such unquestioning loyalty, replied that it was not the task of a soldier to act as judge over his supreme commander. Eichmann, much less intelligent and without any education to speak of, at least dimly realized that it was not an order, but a law which had turned them all into criminals. And so I take the argument to be that what Eichmann realized that the generals didn't is that they were not just following orders, they were following the law, and that the law had a claim on their conscience. And it was this claim that the law had on their conscience that turned them around and made it actually such that, as she says on page 150, the last page of the chapter, evil in the Third Reich had lost its quality by which most people recognize it, the quality of temptation. Many Germans, so evil had lost the quality of temptation. Now evil meant obedience to the law, not temptation to violate the law. Many Nazis, she says, and many Germans, probably an overwhelming majority of them, must have been tempted not to murder, not to rob, not to let their neighbors go off to their doom, and not to become accomplices in all these crimes by benefiting from them. But God knows they had learned how to resist temptation.
What does that mean?
Well, they had
I mean,
learned
what,
how
what
to.
is it? Well, what does that mean to resist? They had learned how not to resist temptation. To me, those are extraordinary words.
No, they had learned. They had learned how to. They learned how to resist temptation. They had learned how to resist the temptation to be good, and in order and simply to do.
But
That's
how did they
sarcasm.
learn? How, what great moral thinker is the teacher of people, of human beings, to resist temptation? I mean, it's Kant, isn't it?
Christ.
Okay, Roger. I mean, this is a question maybe you and I can discuss. I don't want to take up any more of your time.
Well, no, but Bob, you had said something. You said it was of course, it's sarcasm, but I think the sarcasm doesn't mean. I don't know how you interpret the sarcasm. I mean it to suggest that the argument she's making is that they had learned to resist temptation to be good. They had learned to see obedience to law, even an evil law, as conscientious duty. And this was the moral collapse that the Nazis brought onto both themselves and their victims. I mean, I don't know if that's how you interpret it, Bob, or you seem to suggest otherwise.
No, I'm saying that it's sarcasm, that she has contempt, for those who are seemingly resisted temptation.
Absolutely.
It's Sam. Can I just add something to that? I mean, I definitely read it as sarcasm, but I think part of that for Arendt in thinking about this question of what it means to be a law-abiding citizen in a totalitarian regime is this question of responsibility, which she's wrestling with throughout this text, and about the fact that the trial ultimately isn't about just holding Eichmann accountable for his participation. And so she's also, I think, in these passages reflecting on the emptying out of bureaucracy, the way in which bureaucracy makes nobody responsible for what is happening. And also, this temptation too, she's thinking about the moral corruption of bureaucracy in a totalitarian regime, which doesn't hold anybody responsible or accountable for their actions, and in the same stroke erases the possibility for human action by making spontaneity impossible, so that people don't have the free ability to make decisions to act in a moral way. So I read that in those passages as well, just not the on the head, part of it too.
She had this essay, The Question of German Guilt, in which she was arguing that where everybody is guilty, nobody is guilty. So she drew a distinction, between the levels of guilt. And I think in this case, this is the lowest level of guilt. People who kind of hid, they didn't have the temptation, they didn't pull any triggers, send anybody to transports. But after the war, perhaps, they pled totally innocent, which she does not find to be the case. She doesn't swallow that argument.
So
Roger,
Peter?
I've spoken already. I'll come.
Someone else trying to talk?
yeah, Roger, this is Jack.
Hi, Jack.
I just wanted to say that I want to go back to the behavior of the Jewish leaders, the Judenrat and others, and something that you said, which made it sound like she is making an equivalence between people who had options and people who did not. That is, the persecutors and the victims. Persecutors can make choices that victims cannot. And so Peter has kind of outlined the limits of the options that the victims had. And unfortunately,
that it was in an environment where, as Sam has pointed out, an environment of a kind of a total failure of the positive side of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy at its worst is Wannsee. Bureaucracy at its worst is the entire program of the final solution, and those who I hate to use the word cooperated because not exactly cooperate. It certainly isn't collusion, but those who cooperated were caught up in a bureaucracy of their own. That is, they created a bureaucracy that mirrored the bureaucracy that was murdering, and it was hard not to in that environment.
So just to be clear, if I was actually trying to suggest exactly the opposite of what you said I suggested, if I was not trying to suggest that she was creating an equivalency between the Jews and the Germans. I was trying to say that what she says is precisely the opposite. The Germans are the ones who caused the Holocaust. They're the ones to blame. She's not in any way blaming the Jews for the Holocaust.
I understand.
What she's trying to say is that we can still ask the question about conscience and judgment on all the different levels that she raises it in these chapters.
No, I understand what you're saying, but what you quoted really right out of the book. I'm sorry, I'm in a place now here where I don't have the book in front of me. But what you quoted certainly implied that the moral collapse that she perceived among the Jews, that is, those who cooperated, was more reprehensible in some way. That was the moral collapse that, as a Jew, she felt the deepest. And that it sounds like I believe that isn't what she meant, that they were the worst, but it sounds like she's saying that, and I can understand why some people then take that to be her point of view.
Yeah, no, the line, and this is the line that I think probably is most objected to in the whole book, where she says, to a Jew, this role of the Jewish leaders in the destruction of their own people is undoubtedly the darkest chapter of the whole dark story. And I think, and I see why you're saying that. I mean, I think you have to take it as I think she means it, which is to a Jew, to me as a Jew. Obviously, this is not the worst thing that happened in some way. And yet, as a Jew, the fact that Jews did this is to me, well, as she says, the darkest chapter of the whole dark story. And what she means by that, I will say, is somewhat dark to me.
I just want to be sure that everybody understands that this is not an anti-Semitic comment.
I certainly don't think it's anti-Semitic, but go. Susan.
I wonder if you could look at it in a way of almost like a child who was abused by a stranger as opposed to a parent. That, the loss of trust, the loss of any form of safety from your own community is in some ways even more devastating. I just want to, just for the record, say this, just reading it this week was so painful. I've read it before, I've read it all before, and I just have to say it was just incredibly painful to read this again and the whole thing. So I just want to acknowledge that to everybody and for everybody.
Thanks. That's good.
I'd like to add to that.
Can I just ask, Susan, when you say it was painful, can you say a little bit more about why?
I don't know if it's the situation we're living in right now, where there are so many horrific things happening, and so it felt less remote in some way. It felt so real and palpable that people were experiencing this, and somehow or another this current crisis we're in feels, it's not comparable, I understand that, but it just made it feel so present. And so anyhow, I've read it all before, but it was still so difficult to encounter this material.
Thanks. Peter, I know I cut you off. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Correct. Okay. Yeah, it's funny. It almost for me parallels what I was reading about Eichmann is that I similarly had, and I've read so much of this, but this is just brilliantly written and brilliantly put forth, but horribly the recounting of it is so painful until it's not. Because after a while, I found myself reading what had been so painful and not being as pained by it as I continued, which to me means I'm beginning to protect myself against the unbelievable pain of a lack of what we want to believe is humanity, but let's say it's humanity. That people had stopped being humane, they had become something that we wish to believe is really the essence of who we are. It's certainly a part of who we are, but I think sometimes we're mythologizing how humane we are as a human being. Not that we're not humane, but that is the dominant form of who we are. And so I found that as I was looking back on it, especially hearing the last comment, I was thinking, well, how did I lose that? And that to me, I hate to say it, I buy what I think is the point being made by Eichmann as the example, is how he could make such a change. At some point, I think it's a big thing to say he didn't hear any other protests. And I can't believe he heard none at all. But the dominant voices were not protesting. They were gleeful, as she describes in the Wannsee Conference. It wasn't, could Heydrich convince them? It was, could he stay with them in their enthusiasm of how they could perhaps outdo each other? And I think the thing I think about a lot is some of the stuff that we learn more and more about bystander behavior, that this thing called audience response, that I go in and look at something happening, I think it's horrible, but I look around and all the faces look flat. And I begin to think, well, maybe I've got this wrong, and maybe this isn't as bad as I thought, even though my immediate reaction was that thing we hope is true of this impulse that either we've been acculturated to believe or honestly do have as part of our survival mechanism, that it's wrong to do harm to another. And I think it can be overcome. And I think the Nazi example, the dynamics of the Holocaust and what the Nazis accomplished, is to prove that there's ways to turn off this impulse in ourselves and create, we probably like Stolthagen, but these willing executioners. And I think instead we want to believe they had to be coerced, but instead Goldhagen is like at least making the argument that it didn't take that much coercion. The last thing I'll say, then I'll shut up, I'm sorry for talking so long, is I do think there's a difference between who's responsible and who's culpable. And I think everyone, it's hard to not claim was responsible. You can't do the horrors that were done without a lot of people being responsible, because there weren't enough ideological Nazis to kill all those folks. You had to have accomplices. You had to have people who were also responsible, whether equally or not is a good question. But culpable, more and more as you read what Arendt puts out. I don't see the argument for culpability on Eichmann's part if you accept the various things that she states in these last 3 chapters or so. I'm sorry for taking so long.
No, it's great. And, just to say, as I think I've already mentioned, but we'll come back to it near the end of the book, she's going to still argue that Eichmann is culpable. Because she's going to make an argument that participation in such a system is culpability. So she will make that. I think what Susan and Peter just said is really powerful, and I just want to highlight it with a little bit of the text that we haven't looked at on page 131. I think this is painful, and I think it's hard to read, and I think what Susan and Peter both said, that right now reading it, when so many people are having to think about if and when and how they should resign, if and how and when they should participate or not participate in things that they find wrong and inhumane. So she comes on 131. She says, even more pertinent than Dr. Servatius's question was what Eichmann said about this episode in his last statement. Nobody, he repeated, came to me and reproached me for anything in the performance of my duties. Not even Pastor Gruber claims to have done so. And so Pastor Gruber, Probst Gruber, had said to the jury, I never told him that this was wrong. he said, I acted in ways that he should have seen it, but I never told him. And Arendt says, it actually matters when you tell people. It actually matters when you say it. And I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, the case of Franz Jägerstätter, the Austrian conscientious objector who refused to say the loyalty oath and was eventually put to death during the war. He's been recently he's been canonized, and now there's a new movie about him by Terrence Malick. But what was, I think, the most important and fascinating part of that movie is not Jägerstätter and his conscience, which is powerful. And if you want to see what a conscience is, I encourage you to watch this movie. But what was the key to that movie and what made the movie so powerful was the need for the Germans to get him to sign that loyalty oath and not kill him without it. They were desperate. And it was because him not signing that oath, him refusing to, was him, in a sense, being somebody who comes to them and reproaches them for what they're doing. And that's what they couldn't stand. And so I think for Arendt, this is something she'll thematize again later in her work on thinking and moral considerations and others, where she says that what thinking can do is make you stop and think. And while thinking usually has no political implications, in extreme situations, what it can do is make you and make other people think what they are doing. And that's what she is saying didn't happen to Eichmann. No one stopped and made him think. And that's an extraordinary claim.
Can I ask a question in that regard, Roger?
Yes, Jason.
I'm coming at this as not someone with a psychology background, but there seems to be two worlds here. On the one side of the pulpit is the Reich and their ideology, and on the other side is us and the court in Jerusalem. And both sides are internally consistent with what they're saying. One side seems to be approaching it from a very tribal perspective of reinforcement internally, of vilifying the other, and thereby justifying violence. And the other side of the discussion seems to be saying, but we're human beings first, and that our fundamental survival mode is based on our ability to work together. And that tribalism that was introduced later in our evolutionary scale, maybe, is a local adaptation to various problems that come from there being so many people, and we need support, and we gather that support by defining the tribe. The definition of a tribe is exclusion. That's actually kind of one of the fundamental roles of tribalism, is to define the other and then rally against that. So I don't know if this is, coming from a urbanist point of view, this is probably not, good science, but I don't know how everyone else thinks about this, and that the two perspectives, the two fundamentally different perspectives, I would like to see maybe if there's a way to talk about it without so much literal locations, without so much literal names, and say, well, are we looking at a component of human nature, human condition?
It's really interesting, because I think the way you described it as sort of tribalism versus humanism is without a doubt one way to describe this and see this, and it's probably the dominant way we think about it today. But at least in this book, and at least in these chapters, those words are almost absent in Arendt, right? What she's actually trying to say is this was not an example of fanaticism, not an example of tribalism. She's reading it very much, and again, I'm not saying she's right or wrong, She's reading it as an exploration of Eichmann's conscience. And in that sense, it's not between tribalism and humanism. It's between fidelity to a law as a conscientious ideal versus fidelity to my own conscience outside of and independent of the law as an independent person. We haven't mentioned Kant, but this is the chapter in which she talks about Eichmann's invocation of Kant and the categorical imperative, which, of course, on the one hand, he gets right, and on the other hand, he bastardizes. But he was able to articulate a fairly accurate literal account of the categorical imperative, which he said was act as if the principle of your actions were he said, I meant by my remark about Kant that the principle of my will must always be such that it can become the principle of general laws, which is actually pretty accurate. And general, you can't will theft, because if that became a general law, everyone would steal and there'd be no property. And you can't will murder, because if that became a general law, everyone would murder and we'd all be dead. But he didn't understand that this principle that I have to will the universal law is also a matter of judgment, which rules out blind obedience. And he just ignored that part. And it strikes me that Arendt is reading this, is actually trying to take us out of the tribalist humanist divide or framework into this framework of how is it, and this is I think what Peter and Susan were really getting at, how is it that our conscience, step by step, slowly, whether it's over 9 years from 33 to 42, or over 3 weeks from Wannsee to when he gave up or gave in, how our conscience turns around and it actually becomes easier to obey an evil law than to give in to the temptation to be moral. That's what I think she's really after here. And she doesn't frame it in the tribalist. I mean, that's all I'll say, but I think it's important.
But it's interesting how you characterize it, because I think from our perspective, that's the dilemma between doing what your conscience says and obeying an evil law. But I still think what Eichmann is doing is finding convenient solace in the law and not judging its evil or non-evil part to it. It's more, here's my way out of following my conscience, which seems to be a dead end for me. I'm going to lose everything I hoped for if I follow my conscience. Nobody else seems to be with me on that endeavor. So how do I get out of this? How do I maintain myself? Oh, I've got this law and I signed on to it. In fact, every civil servant, our God in a way is the Constitution of the United States. We all are, at least government officials are supposed to, whether that's working at the moment or not, we're supposed to be following it, not unconditionally, but with great loyalty. And here, their law had become Hitler. The statement is correct. In the land that they're living in, the Führer's words are the law.
You've hit your mute button somehow.
He uses that law as the means for him to escape the unpalatable consequences of his conscience.
I think that's right.
I think, Roger, I'm sorry, Scott, go ahead.
Scott, go ahead.
To go back to the Judenrat controversy a little bit, and for those of you there who can inform me, please do so, because I'm not as well read as many of you on this. But when she brought up the point about the Judenrat, the one I think it was a rabbi who said that we knew that 50% were going to go off to their death, but 50% may survive. And then she brought up the point, well, that's better than 99%. Was the calculus ever taken in with Arendt? Did she ever bring up the calculus by, let's say, by 1943? It was obvious the Allies were making major headways on both fronts, and that some of the people, perhaps some of the Judenrat may have been taking a calculus. Well, hey, we're going to be sending some people off, but hey, this war is going to be done in 13 months or 12 months or whatever, and it was just kind of a gamble. It seems to me from a very, please forgive me if I'm off on some of this. It seems to me like if you were going to be sent off in 1940 or 41, you might have been under the kind of impression, like Arbeit macht frei, that, hey, I'm just going to go to this place, it's going to suck, I'm going to work, and then, maybe there's a chance of me living. But by 1943, when you know that extermination is probably going to happen, you might say, I might live long enough until the Americans and the Russians come. And I don't know if that was ever taken into consideration with her comment there.
I don't know that she ever commented on that, on the end of the war question that you asked. I mean, I think she does make a distinction between potentially those who did it earlier in the war who didn't yet know what was happening, and those, especially in Hungary, who did it later in the war who knew precisely what was happening. I don't know of any comments she makes about whether they strategically tried to draw it out. I mean, I think what she would say is, if you thought the war was nearly over and you wanted to try and save people, the best thing to do would be to sow chaos and let people try and escape and hope they could live until the end of the war. So, I mean, that seems to be her approach. I think, what she's trying to say is that the moral approach, the approach of good judgment, is actually pragmatically also probably the better approach in saving your people. Which, I mean, if you want to put it into a modern analysis, a modern analogy, I mean, you might think about human rights workers, or, for example, let's just use an example, the UN in Palestine with refugee camps, or not even Palestine. Let's just use refugee camps. So one argument is that the UN should organize and provide medicine and food and order for refugee camps. The other argument that many people make, some of them on Arendtian grounds, including me, and I think it's not a wrong argument, it's certainly Arendtian, that doing so actually justifies and prolongs the situation of refugees. And it might be better for the refugees to, in a sense, be chaotic and forced to actually force the issue and fight for their rights, rather than be pacified in a human rights camp where they're treated like living animals increasingly. And so I think Arendt, in other works of hers where she writes about human rights, I mean, she makes this claim, I think, quite clearly, that human rights has a tendency to dehumanize the people that it seeks to protect. I mean, it's a separate issue, but it's not unrelated to what we're talking about here.
Roger, I'd like to
Can I say something?
Yeah, Jack? Let someone else come in who hasn't
Daphne,
spoken yet.
Go ahead, Daphne.
I can't believe I agree with you, Roger, about the Palestinian camps, but I wanted to say that when Arendt was writing this book, it came at a time where she had another agenda which we're not at all touching upon, which is she believed throughout that this was a show trial. And when she is discussing the complicity of Eichmann and whether or not he was an evil man and had, say, legally intended the consequences that he actually created and was culpable. It was also at a time when it was known to her and to many of the scholars of the period in Israel that Ben-Gurion himself had basically encouraged some of the policies, not knowing necessarily what the evil was, but at the time that this was beginning, to let more Jews leave Germany so that they could become Zionists. And in a sense, to completely negate the culpability of Jews in creating this theory, this theater show trial, as well as to totally deny any responsibility for anything that ever happened because they were only victims, is one of the issues that I think Hannah Arendt struggled with. And so I think that is very important that we don't forget that that was part of the struggle that she had with assessing Eichmann's own culpability.
It may have been a show trial, but how else would you have brought Eichmann to justice?
No, I'm not saying that it shouldn't have happened, and I don't know if justice was accomplished because he was just one of many in an apparatus. So I'm not saying that he shouldn't have been brought to trial. I'm just saying that she struggled with this.
I think that's right. And because it's something I'm interested in, Bob, there is one other way to bring Eichmann to justice that she'll discuss in the epilogue on page 277. So we'll get there in a couple weeks. But she actually suggests that it might have been more just for Israel to simply have assassinated him in Buenos Aires, and then brought the soldiers who did so back and put them on trial for murder and ask if they had done the right thing. So we'll talk about that when we get to the epilogue. That's something I've written a fair bit about, and it's actually an issue I'm quite interested in. So just so you know, there is at least one other way that she thinks of that might have been more just. Because I think maybe two things Daphne and I agree on today. I think she did, in a way, think this trial. I mean, she has mixed feelings about the trial. I think she had really amazing respect for the judges, and really thought they tried desperately to keep this focused on the question of justice and Eichmann's guilt or innocence or guilt. I mean, everyone knew he was guilty, but how and why? But I think she was very suspicious of the uses the trial was being put to, as Daphne was saying.
Was the trial of Roger Stone a show trial?
I hope
or
not.
Is there an aspect of show in it?
I don't know. I mean, it wasn't televised so far as I know, and as far as I know, it was a trial for things he actually did wrong.
And I don't think his crimes are comparable in any way.
That's true. Roger,
yeah, go ahead.
Roger, I thought the context of this whole thing was fairness on her part, namely, this was sort of the defense by Eichmann's team. She didn't think much of the defense, obviously, and part of what she thought was give a fairer view of the cooperation of the Jewish councils to help ameliorate what Eichmann's defense should have been doing to try to ameliorate his guilt. And that's how I thought it was a question of fairness on her part doing this. I know it got into other issues and bigger issues, but
I think that's good.
I think Roger, can I say something? I think one of the big issues as well is I think her book in some ways is a show book. Her version of Eichmann, I think, is a creation as much as it is also the historical record. I particularly thought that in the stuff we're reading this week on the Wannsee trial. I don't see Eichmann as someone who wandered into that meeting and was impressed what was being said about it. I suspect he was more likely one of the most enthusiastic in that room. Maybe not for ideological reasons, maybe for reasons of his own, but this is someone who had shown an extraordinary talent for doing horrible things. It doesn't connect with me that he's being persuaded in any way.
I'd like to jump in here for a second. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Jack.
Go ahead, Roger.
No, I was going to say, I think that the book becomes a show book very much at the end. I mean, I'm going to make that argument when we get to the epilogue. And I think that he's trying to show what doing justice would mean, her writing. But we'll get there at the epilogue in the end. So, Jack, go ahead.
I can
I have two things. One is, first of all, I wanted to say that along the lines of what Daphne was talking about, that ever since the first time I read this, which was actually in the pages of the New Yorker when I was considerably younger, I immediately thought of it as a justification, the trial as a Zionist justification for the existence of Israel as opposed to the biblical one. There has to be a place for the Jews to be, and I think that was part of the why people thought of it as a show trial. But I want to talk about something very different, which has to do with the Wannsee Conference, because the Wannsee Conference, we have a complete record of what was said and done at the Wannsee Conference. It was stenographically recorded, so to speak, and that was used as the basis for a play to movies and so on and so forth. So if you don't want to read it, you can see it. But the thing about the Wannsee Conference is that it is a demonstration, especially if you see it dramatized, a demonstration of how a bureaucratic rule can overcome resistance. It's really interesting to observe the ways in which different people who were there at the conference, who may have had some resistance, and some of it was very strong, how they were overcome, and the thing ended up in total consensus. And that's a lesson in how bureaucracies work that I think is very important, because it's something that we're seeing today again. And I fear that the coronavirus team is going to take its lessons from Wannsee.
So the bureaucracy point that some of you have made is right on, and obviously, as you know, Arendt found as she says in one book, the two great threats to democracy today are the size of government, the centralization of government, and the bureaucratization of government. Both disempower people and make it hard to find even who to resist and how to resist things that one opposes.
Timothy Snyder, in his book on tyranny, lists number one, anticipatory obedience, as one of the hallmarks for how not just you can see it coming, but also how tyranny wins. And people want to please, and they want to show off how they can do something that facilitates the new regime. This is at least what he points out happened in Austria before, which was on the heels of the Anschluss. Even before the Nazis had gone there, the Austrians were ahead of the game. I think I may have mentioned this before. I want to go back for a second to Scott's point, and how people, without question, must have seen some possibility that the war would end, and that may have guided their thoughts, whether Arendt is considering this or not. I think everybody's pointed out that she had a different focus in this book. But I think that's still important, especially in light of a lot of the choices made by the Judenrat and others throughout the war. Let's make a double hypothesis scenario. And again, I think all people are prisoners of hope. So that's also how people survive a situation that was against the odds. If you're stuck in some horrible desert where there's no way anybody could possibly get to you, the ones who survive, for some reason, think they will. It seems ridiculous, but it actually is an important capacity to have if you want to survive impossible situations. But if you do a double hypothesis with Hungary, let's say you have not just a few Jews, you have 800,000 Jews in Hungary. That's a sizable number. Let's say they sow chaos and confusion in the early 40s up to 43, or even the early part of 44, because they see the writing on the wall and they say, we're not going to just sit passively here. We're going to become political. We're going to get highly organized. And let's say this horrific Hungarian government, which was more than happy to do certain things even within Hungary, starts going after them. And then in 44, the war ends, not in 45. And you say, I think the notes would have been, if only the Jews had stayed quiet, 800,000 could have survived what happened in Hungary. You think it's so easy to be 2020, hindsight and post-game quarterbacking. It's a good job, but it doesn't really match the reality.
I hear that. We have about 15 minutes left, and Susan Tucker has about 7 questions in the text, and I just want to make sure I get to some of them. Susan, is there a particular question you want to highlight? You're on.
You can take any of them. It's okay.
Okay. Well, the first one is, that she pitched the story to the New Yorker, saying she wanted to see Eichmann for herself. How is it she apparently attended only the opening statements and summations? So the trial lasted months. Yes, she did write to the New Yorker and saying, I wanted to see Eichmann in the flesh. She clearly had written about his type before in The Origins of Totalitarianism. She stayed, I think, the first time about, I think, 7 to 10 days. Saw the opening arguments and the beginning of the prosecution. Then she actually went to visit her friend and mentor Karl Jaspers, and then came back at the end of the trial for the very end of it. She read very closely the transcript. So, you ask, is reading the trial transcript is not the same as observing and witnessing testimony and cross-examination? And I think you're right. There's no way I can deny that. I don't know if anybody, I'm not sure if any journalist stayed for the whole trial. I mean, it's a long trial. But I think she felt that she got a sense of the main characters in watching it, and then obviously spent a lot of time not only reading the transcript, but if you read the bibliography that she provides, it's pretty extensive. She read a ton of other journalist reports. I will say that one of the controversies of the book that's less known but is important is that Raoul Hilberg, who wrote The Destruction of the European Jews, which came out in 1961, well, before it came out, Arendt was asked to be an anonymous reader for that book, and she wrote a very negative review of it, suggesting that it shouldn't be published. She then cites the book extensively in this book, and in many places relies on it and doesn't cite it. And Raoul Hilberg, his whole life, thought she had plagiarized him. But she read a ton. She read a lot of stuff by Eichmann that he had written, the Sassen Papers, other stuff, and got an enormous amount of documents. I mean, no one else, certainly at that time, had read as much on it. Not that I know of, and I don't think so. So, which is not to say that it might have been different if she'd stayed for the whole thing. I don't know. But that's as much as I can say.
Do you know why? Did she say why she didn't? I'm not saying she should have been there every day.
I think she wanted to. I think she had a life. I think she didn't want to spend 6 months at a trial or whatever.
Well, I'm not saying 6 months, but I don't know. To me, it's just curious. I mean, even if you think about recently for us watching the so-called trial and the House hearings, you didn't have to sit through the whole thing, but actually watching it for yourself, seeing people's demeanor makes a difference in terms of understanding who the people are.
She watched a total of about 10 days of it, which again is not everything, but is a lot.
Okay. I won't belabor it.
I don't know much else to say. I mean, I know there are people who've criticized her for that. Deborah.
I think part of the problem was that she did believe it was, to some extent, a show trial, and they were parading a lot of the people who, if you read the transcript, who repeated the same horror stories. And so she already knew that. I don't know if it was intentional that she was being disrespectful of the procedures, but just look at the transcript and you'll see what she basically avoided was the repetition and the parading of what she believed was the same story over and over and over again.
Do you know how much of Eichmann's testimony and cross-examination she observed?
Came back for the very end of it.
So she just to jump in for a second, Susan, I would point you to her correspondence with her husband, Heinrich Blücher, where she talks about, she actually really debates with herself about when she should leave and when she should come back. And she doesn't want to miss what's important, but she's also very frustrated from the beginning of the trial that it is, Daphne just said, that it's a show trial, and that most of the days Eichmann wasn't even mentioned or questioned, even though it was ostensibly a trial about Eichmann. And I think it's just also important to add that, she did read all the transcripts from the trial. She had them, I think it was over 10,000 pages, more than that. I can't remember the exact number, but she went through them and read them. So she wasn't physically there for the whole thing, but she did have access to what was said. And then there was also just another artifact that might be of interest to you is the Topography of Terror Museum in Berlin about 10 or 12 years ago did an exhibit on Eichmann and the trial and Arendt's coverage of it. And I believe they put out a book about it, which is also just a nice artifact in addition to the ones that exist.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Yep. Susan, I'm going to look at your last question next. You say, I'm still not understanding the significance of conscience fanaticism, anti-Semitic motivation. Isn't the question in some ways simple, whether Adolf Eichmann or any defendant intended the expected consequences of his action? If he arranged transport for the Jews to the killing fields, he must presume to intend the natural consequences of his act, mens rea, whatever his motive or desire or belief, unless he was crazy to stand trial. So I think that's a good question. I think Arendt would probably agree with you. The judges, and again, we'll get to this in the final chapters on the judgment and appeal, which is where she's going to talk about this more directly. But the judges had a problem in that they were trying to actually judge Eichmann according to the law, and in this case, the law of Israel, the criminal law of Israel, where the trial was being held. And under the law of Israel, the question was, could Eichmann be held guilty of murder, let alone mass murder, because he actually never murdered anyone? And Susan, you're saying, well, he knew the logical expected consequences of his actions. A
little like felony murder.
Yes, and so what they said is he was basically an accomplice. Now Israel, as far as I can tell, based on what she talks about, didn't have a felony murder rule and didn't have a conspiracy rule. And so what the judges said is that on our law, what he was basically guilty with was aiding and abetting murder and genocide. And what she says is, this is ridiculous. I mean, to think that what Adolf Eichmann was guilty of was aiding and abetting is just a travesty of legalism. And the judges realized that too to some degree, but they felt caught by the law. And so that's when she sort of turns it around and says, we need to rethink how we're going to do justice here and how we do justice in this kind of a situation in which the law is inadequate. So,
Roger.
Yeah, Scott.
Maybe I before you mentioned Susan's last question, I read it and maybe I misunderstood it. Was she Susan? Were you asking if what Eichmann expected the consequences of his actions were while he was actually carrying out the operation, or after he was arrested?
No, I think at the time that he, let's say, arranged transport
Okay,
for people to go to the concentration camps, knowing
right.
what was
So,
happening
so,
there.
right. So my guess is, and maybe I'm way off here, and I'm sure you guys will let me know if I am. My guess is he thought he was going to get a nice position in the Thousand-Year Reich. I don't think that maybe at the end, maybe once he went off to Argentina, he realized that he was in trouble. But I think if you would have asked him 8 months before, he's like, hey, I'm set up in the Thousand-Year Reich in a nice position. I don't know if
Well,
that's too simplistic.
that might have been his motive or his desire, but on the other hand, meanwhile, whatever he's doing to get ahead professionally, he's arranging for people to be put on trains to be killed. So he knew that. So that all I'm saying is, it seemed to me the question of whether he was a fanatic or an anti-Semite, in a way, is beside the point, because the acts he took were designed to facilitate the killing of people.
Which is just
Yeah.
just because we're close to time, which is why everybody knew he was guilty, right?
Yeah.
In some sense, as Arendt says many times, there was no need to
It could have been
actually
a short trial.
do a lot of this because we all knew he was guilty. The
Yeah.
question really was, what was he guilty of, and how are we going to express that, and how are we going to how are we going to prove it if we need to? We don't really need to prove it, but what are we going to say he's guilty of? And to the extent that the court tried to make it a legal question, she's critical of that. To the extent that the prosecution tried to say he was guilty of fanaticism, she's like, look, that's not necessary, and that may not have even been right. To the extent you want to say that he was, a question of conscience, she says that's an interesting issue. It wasn't legally relevant, but I actually think that's an important issue, so let's talk about it. I mean, I think that's how she's thinking about these questions here in this book. Are there any other?
Let me ask one more really quick question. Has any, with research that has happened, psychological research that has happened over the last, half century since this, we find out a lot about, people who are psychopaths. They don't have a capacity for empathy in any regard. So, somebody like that who would manifest evil, would fill Eichmann's role and then go home and beat his wife and kick his kid and kick his dog and all of that. And I guess my question is, and maybe there are some psychologists amongst the group here, but has anybody been able to go back, after the fact now and with today's knowledge of psychopathy, been able to see to me, it would seem obvious, like Julius Streicher is a psychopath. To me, that would seem, as a layperson, that would seem very obvious to me. But has anybody been able to go back from today's standpoint and go back and look at these Nazis like Göring and all of these people and be able to say, Göring, if he grew up in Ohio and in 1900 would have probably just been a decent person, whereas so-and-so would have been evil no matter what. I don't know.
I'll say this. I think there were probably some psychopaths. I think it's very hard to do a psychological exam post facto. But what Arendt is saying is that while there may have been some psychopaths, none of this could have happened without people like Eichmann, who, in her mind, clearly was not a psychopath. And I mentioned before
absolutely.
The movie, the decent one, Der Anständige, about Himmler, who, if you watch that movie and you read his diaries and you hear him speaking, because all the words in that movie are from him, from his diaries, it's clear that Himmler was not a psychopath. And when you realize that so much of this was done by people who, for step by step, for whatever reasons, complied, coordinated, cooperated with a regime that in some ways part of them knew was wrong, but they resisted that inclination for whatever reasons, for bureaucratic reasons, to get ahead, to obey the law, because of conscience. It's a powerful indictment of how easy it is for the conscience to get turned around. And I think that's what these chapters today that we read are really makes them so difficult and so painful, as Susan said.
If I could just say, though, there were tests given to the folks who were in the main trial, and they were exactly in keeping with what Scott said. Only Stryker came out based on Rorschach tests to be within that zone of being what could be called a psychopath. The others were not, and people all claimed the tests were bad, not that the people were. It couldn't have been possible because we don't want to believe that these are people like us.
Yeah, so there you go. So Stryker is the obvious example. I'm sure there were others, but I think the vast majority were not. And that's the hard truth that we need to confront, and that I think what makes this book worthwhile is that Arendt confronts it head on. All right. Listen, thank you guys. This was great. These are hard chapters to read. They're painful. We're gonna continue with the next on the chapters on the deportations. These are really interesting chapters. They're very historical, but they're also you'll see a lot of interesting moral and ethical asides throughout them that I think are worth paying attention to. So look forward to the next one, and I wish you all continued enjoyment reading Hannah Arendt. Thank you very much.
Goodbye, everybody.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Roger.
Thank you, guys.